you so much, Lawrence, and thank you to all of you for being here, and a biggest thank you to the 92nd Street Y. 92nd Street Y is a place where the big conversations about our future and the future of our country and our world happen, and it's just such a pleasure and honor for me to be here today talking about what I believe is probably the most important issue of all of our lifetimes, and that's the issue of human genetic enhancement. After our species has been around for about 200,000 years, but we've evolved for the last 4 billion years. And now for the first time in that history, we are right on the verge of taking active control of our evolutionary process. And it's such a big issue. It's almost too big for us to understand. And if we were to freeze science today, to say that there will be no more revolutionary advances in science and technology, all we're going to have is just evolution of technologies that already exist with a speed roughly equivalent to what already exists. If we were just to do that, we have everything that we need to create genetically enhanced humans in, drum roll please, 10 months. 10 months. Which is 1 month, because next month the British House of Parliament is going to vote on a process called mitochondrial transfer. And then if that is successful, as I believe it will be, then 9 months from that to when the first genetically three-parent child will be born. Active genetic manipulation. And we all know about these little individual stories that have been very important. The Human Genome Project, the revolution in vitro fertilization, embryo selection, called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. The Human Genome Project and the advances in information technology so that our ability to read the genome has gone from costing $1 billion 10 years ago to $3,000 today to roughly nothing 10 years from now. And when you put all of these existing technologies and new technologies that we'll talk about tonight, like CRISPR or gene editing, we are right on the verge and passing through the door towards our genetic future. Already, in many places around the world, genetic selection is part of the birth process with IVF. Already, we've passed what used to be the barrier between therapeutic manipulation and germline heritable manipulation, and that's the story of mitochondrial transfer I mentioned a moment ago. So we were right on the verge of this fundamental transformation of really what it means to be a human being and how we reproduce as human beings. And one of the things that I've been saying over and over is this really is the end of sex. Not sex for fun, not sex for pair bonding and for all the wonderful reasons why people have sex, but this really is the end of sex as a means of procreation for advantaged people around the world. And think about that. Think about how huge that is. And this revolution is not only coming, the revolution is already here. And we have this situation where, as we'll discuss tonight, the science is advancing exponentially, our imagination is increasing linearly, and the regulatory framework is only inching forward glacially. So there's this massive mismatch between what's possible and how we are thinking about and processing what's possible. And just like we've been talking about, a few people have been talking about Ebola for the last however many years, and we could have had, for the last 10 years, last 20 years, a really informed conversation about Ebola, and all the pieces were there, but we didn't have it. And then one day, somebody with Ebola shows up in the United States, and all of a sudden we have this insane conversation about the 3 people with Ebola in the United States, not the tens of thousands of people, the thousands of people who are dying from Ebola at its source in West Africa. And unless we have the conversation today about not only the science, but the massive personal and societal implications of these technologies, one day in the not distant future, genetically modified people are going to show up and everyone's going to freak out and we're not going to be able to have these kinds of conversations. And so that's why, for me, it was so important to bring really what I believe is the dream team. If I was I know I was in Beijing in 2008 in the basketball, and there was this team. It was like all the superstars of the NBA. If I were just to kind of take a step back and say, like, what's the dream team if we wanted to have a conversation about the future of genetic enhancement, the ethical issues and the scientific issues? I really don't think I could do any better than the amazing panel who we have here tonight. So if I can call out our panelists, and we will get rolling. There we go. Yeah. Great. So I will do quick introductions, and you have some of this information in your program. But our dream team from left to right. First, George Church is professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School and director of personalgenomes.org. His 1984 Harvard PhD, and why is it always 1984, includes the first methods for direct genome sequencing, and his innovations have contributed to nearly all next-generation genome sequencing methods and to the establishment of companies across the fields of genomics, medical diagnostics, and synthetic biology. He's received numerous awards and is director of the NIH Center for Excellence in Genomic Science. He's co-authored 330 papers, has 60 patents, and one book, Regenesis. It's a fantastic book, and he's going to be signing it out in the lobby after the program. And if you'd like to know him better, you can download his entire sequence genome and rummage through it yourself. What I will say about George, and I truly believe this, George is the person in the entire world with the least amount of privacy. Would you agree? I mean, you couldn't have less privacy than George has in a really impressive way. Lee Silver is an internationally renowned Princeton molecular biologist and expert in biomedical ethics and the legal and societal challenges posed by advances in biotechnology. He's the author of many publications, including Challenging Nature and Remaking Eden, Cloning and Beyond in a Brave New World. He's testified on reproductive and genetic technologies before the US Congress and New York State Senate. And his new company, GenePeaks, has pioneered preconception genetic screening to assess potential sperm and egg donors, and as we'll discuss, it will be soon screening for everybody who's thinking about having children. So if you want to invest, now's the time. Susan Solomon, to my right, my friend Susan, is chief executive and co-founder of the New York Stem Cell Foundation, a nonprofit organization established in 2005, which were the dark days of stem cell research in the United States, to accelerate cures through stem cell research. She's a longtime healthcare advocate and founding member and current president of New Yorkers for the Advancement of Medical Research, and is on the executive committee for the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. In September 2008, she received the Triumph Award from the Brooke Ellison Foundation for her work in establishing New York Stem Cell Foundation. And to my right is Bob Klitzman, a professor of clinical psychiatry in the College of Physicians and Surgeons and the Joseph Mailman School of Public Health, and director of the Masters of Bioethics program at Columbia. He's written 8 books and authored or co-authored over 90 articles in major scientific and popular publications. He's a gubernatorial appointee for the New York State Stem Cell Commission and is a member of the Research Ethics Advisory Panel of the U.S. Department of Defense. So that's the dream team. And the rough outline of our conversation, but it's going to be all of the issues touch each other. And then we're going to have some time for a conversation as well, but we hope is we're not going to be able to fully address any of the questions we raise. But what we'd like to do is to spark a conversation that you all will take with you into your lives. But we're going to talk about what's possible now, what will very likely be possible in the future, and then what are the huge ethical and societal issues that will need to be addressed. So Susan Solomon, why don't we start with you? When we talk about genetic modification, people go straight to cloned embryos, and there's all this kind of stuff that really scares people, which is maybe in the medium-term future. But in the short-term future, in today, there are all kinds of therapeutic uses of stem cell and genomics that's having a huge positive impact on people's lives. So before we talk about where this may be going, maybe if you and Lee can get us started with a conversation about what's possible today.
Sure. I think stem cell transplants for cancer, I think we're going on about 50 years now of successful outcomes. And so I think when people think about stem cell research and genetic engineering and so forth, it can get pretty scary, but in fact what we're talking about is, for the first time, having a window into a living human body and being able to understand how we're put together. And then I think with stem cell research, you actually have a biological reader for a lot of that data. And now with CRISPR technology and genetic engineering, you can put it all together. So in some of the really tragic diseases that people are dealing with and children are born with, we have an opportunity to reach in, sometimes in utero, sometimes making a decision if a family is known to carry a terrible disease, to not have to be dealing with tragic consequences. And I think that's an extraordinary opportunity. So I think people talk about, one of the consequences, for example, of current consequences of genetic engineering. We just published a paper a couple of weeks ago focusing on a set of identical twins. They both carry the gene for Parkinson's, but one has it, one doesn't. They're in their late 60s. And what we were able to see in the dish was, irrespective of the genetic readout, that actually the unaffected twins' neurons produce less dopamine. That really is incredible. And then we were able to go to sort of the next step and take a look at all of the different pathways, combining the genetic information that we had and the stem cell readout, and figure out a way to actually combine existing drugs to arrest the likely progression and development of that disease. That's amazing, and that's a real gift. So I think rather than kind of thinking about sort of headlines, 3-parent children, which we found ourselves in when in a New York Times article this summer, for a wonderful, wonderful technique that we pioneered, mitochondrial replacement therapy. About 12,000 people a year are diagnosed with mitochondrial disease. That's roughly the same number as are diagnosed with ALS. And we came up with a technique to allow women with this disease to have their own healthy biological children. But yet, headline was, 3-parent child.
Right. And I mean, what you're getting at, you talked about in a dish, which was just 3 words in your answer, but the ability to isolate these neurons, it connects to this bigger story that we're going to talk about of personalized medicine. Right now, most of medicine is general medicine. So you take an aspirin, and it's based on probabilities of how aspirin work for the average population. But in the future, which is already the present, everybody's genome, starting with George, will be on file, and you'll be able to isolate these neurons in a dish, and then you're going to be able to test, you're going to be able to study them in a way that we haven't been able to in a world of general medicine.
Well, we're going to know, we're going to actually develop drugs in an entirely different way than we develop them now. People, have different numbers, but roughly animal studies that we use now for drug testing have about a 1% predictive value, and most drugs fail. 99%, 98.5% of drugs fail. And part of the reason is because we're using animal models, but the other part is that we're assuming that everybody is the same. So we're not paying any attention to our different genetic makeup. And so a drug that might work perfectly fine for me might make you terribly sick and have no effect at all on Lee. Or George and Bob could both be diagnosed with the same illness, but experience very different symptoms. And so we have to introduce into both diagnosing and also treating illness the fact that we're not all the same, we're different, and we can do it in a way I think that actually is quite cost effective.
Absolutely. And by the way, if anyone wants to hear more of Susan, she has a phenomenal TED Talk on this, which I highly recommend. Lee, your new company, GenePeaks, is basically using genomics and predictive genomics to help people make smarter decisions preliminarily in selection of sperm and preconception in the selection of sperm and egg donors. Can you talk just a little bit about how probabilistic thinking and genomics is going to change the way we think about reproduction?
Well, to give an idea of how far we've come in such a short time, it was worth it for me to go back and look at a book that I wrote 18 years ago called Remaking Eden, and I made some outrageous predictions. This is 1996. I predicted that the human genome, a human genome, would be fully sequenced by 2020, and that we would know most of the differences that existed between people, which makes us different, respond to drugs differently, susceptibility to diseases. I thought we would know that by 2030. And anybody in the audience who knows anything about genetics realizes how far off I was. We learned the first human genome was essentially sequenced, meaning we read the 3 billion bases of information in the early 2000s, and we now have a good idea of what the major differences are that distinguish people from each other. And that's been a very, very short period of time, 18 years from knowing almost nothing about the human genome to today, when we have this enormous amount of information. It's difficult to impress this upon people because the field is still called human genetics, and yet the field today is not the same as the field was even 5 years ago in terms of the information. So one piece of this is that the first thing you can do when you gather genetic information and you make associations between different genetic variants and disease, the first thing you can do is you make the associations in a certain population of people, and then you can make predictions in other people. What we decided to do, and the reason I formed GenePeaks, was we wanted to be able to prevent diseases that were not preventable previously. And these are the simplest form of diseases. These are single gene diseases. And we wanted to be able to apply the technology that we were learning about and apply it to 2 individuals, or apply it to a client of a sperm bank and all of the donors, and then bring the DNA sequences together from each client and donor and look at the risk of a simple disease. So that it turns out that simple diseases are not so simple, so the whole process is not as simple as it sounds. But we're at this point now, right now, where we can prevent a whole series of genetic diseases, over 500 different genetic diseases. And it's important to point out when it is that parents learn that they're both carriers for mutations. First, I should say that every single person in this room, everybody up here on the panel, is a carrier.
This is the 92nd Street Y, and I imagine there are a lot of Ashkenazi Jews out here, so we are mega carriers.
Whether you're Jewish or not doesn't matter. Yeah. We all carry these mutations, which are silent because we have a good copy of the gene and we have a copy of the gene that doesn't work. And usually the way people find out about that is they have a child born with the disease. And so when we talk about embryo selection, in most cases what has happened is a couple has a child born with a disease like cystic fibrosis or Tay-Sachs disease or one of the other rare diseases. And they want to have another child, and they don't want that second child to be born with disease. And so they know what caused the disease in the first child, and they're able to select embryos that are not going to be diseased to have a second child.
Let me use that to talk to Bob. I spoke in my introduction about the end of sex, which we're not there for procreative purposes. But what are you seeing? I mean, it just seems that the level, I mean, you do a lot with embryo selection, and we'll talk about some of the ethical issues a little bit later. But what are the trend lines on embryo selection? I mean, is this something like amniocentesis, where it used to be controversial and now it's not? And how do you see things playing out?
Right. So basically what happens is, people may have different understandings of the science. So sperm meets egg, it creates an embryo, 1 cell that then splits to become 2 cells, 4 cells.
My brother's in the audience, he didn't know that, so
yeah, I'm
you.
sure, but just for all I'm saying. So what happens is with pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is we remove one of the 8 cells and we can diagnose it, we can do sequence the entire genome. And People are now saying, let's say, have Huntington's disease, which is a devastating neurologic disease that Woody Guthrie, for instance, famously died of. And people who know they're at risk of Huntington's disease, for which if I have it, there's a 50% chance that each of my children will have it. People will say, well, I only want to use the embryos that don't have the markers associated with Huntington's disease, and will implant those into the womb. People are now doing the same with breast cancer. People are saying, I have terrible breast cancer in my family. My mother, my sister died of it. I'm only going to use the embryos that don't have the genes associated with breast cancer. And so they're using PGD for all kinds of things and many other rare diseases. They're also, however, doing it for gender selection at this point. So there are people who say, I only want a boy. And the doctor will make sure that there's only a boy embryo that's inserted, or boy embryos. And one concern is, of course, the technology is wonderful, and we can cure many, many diseases. But we take the technology and we're entering it into, I would say, a very messy world in which there is a wide gap between the haves and the have-nots. It's widening. The procedure I spoke of, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or PGD, costs at least around $20,000 because it involves IVF. Most insurance companies will not pay for screening embryos to get rid of diseases. And so increasingly we find that people, wealthy people, for instance, will be able to say in the future, we will no longer have certain diseases in our family. We can buy our way out of certain diseases because we'll screen the embryos out.
Yeah, and we're gonna come back to that.
Okay.
So let me stop you there. But again, we've spoken about the genes, and so when you do PGD, we're going to be reading each gene, and each genome contains the blueprint for the entire human, and the exact same analysis. And we know this through the Human Genome Project, and because of Moore's Law, the cost of sequencing is going down towards zero. The same analysis that today can identify single gene mutations, which all the things that you mentioned, Huntington's or gender or all of those things, in the not distant future, we'll be able to, to predict polygenic traits. I spoke with somebody earlier this week who felt that they were 2 years away, he was 2 years away from being able to read a genome and telling within an inch or two how tall somebody was going to be. And when we get to that point, and we are humans, so we're learning more and more about what the genome says, we are going to be able to know whatever genes tell us that we understand, we're going to know from reading that, the genome of that 5-day-old embryo. And that has huge, huge implications that we'll talk about. And so one piece of this story is embryo selection. And I believe that in the future, not only will most advantaged people engaged in embryo selection, and we may even see that it's unfair to the children to give them genetic diseases that will then be seen as preventable, but insurance companies and governments will have a massive incentive to screen all embryos, again, because it'll cost next to nothing, and because the cost of this screening will almost certainly be less on a societal level than the cost of dealing with all of the people who have these, what will then be seen as preventable genetic diseases. So if embryo selection is one of the big issues, the other big issue, and people think that this is something that's way out into the future, but thanks to George Church, it's not, is scientific name CRISPR, the layman's terms, gene editing. So George, if you could tell us a little bit about CRISPR and its implications, and then maybe reference some of the work you're doing on malaria and liver disease.
Right. Broadened it a little bit from CRISPR to gene therapy in general. In the introduction, there was the statement that we might someday be faced with a genetically engineered human. We are already faced. There are 2,000 clinical trials in phase 1, 2, and 3 in the world for 2,000 different diseases, and one of them has been fully approved in Europe for gene therapy, called Glybera for pancreatitis. So there are genetically modified humans. CRISPR is just one of many technologies that's particularly promising because you can rapidly prototype and precisely change, not just add in an extra copy, which is what typically gene therapy has been, but you can alter specific places. Now, back to Bob's point that we can screen for embryos. Well, that assumes that if you start screening for a large number of things, if you screen for one thing, then about half your embryos are okay. If you screen for 2 things, it's going to be 1/4 and so forth. You get up to 10 things and you don't have enough embryos. So the alternative would be to genetically engineer them to be whatever you want them to be. Or you could wait until they're a child or an adult and change them then. And you could say, is that fundamentally different? In other words, sometimes you have to do it. Gene therapies now cure congenital blindness, and you have to do it very early, or else they'll be able to see, but they won't be able to process the information. So you essentially have to do it on non-fully consenting children. How fundamentally different is that from doing it in utero or in sperm and egg? So I think that's where we're headed with this. And some of the CRISPR technology can be used in ways that are essentially preventative medicine, and you alluded to that they can be used in principle to spread resistance to malaria through mosquito populations. And so one of the big things that can impact health care in developing nations are things like that, where you break the feudal cycle of poverty, poor health, and education. So I think that my call on the elite thing, which is always in these conversations, is that cell phones originally required a Rolls Royce to carry it around; they were so heavy, and now almost everybody has access, at least through their community in remote regions, and it's revolutionized microfinance and things like that. So, I think I don't see any real barriers to getting the cost of gene therapy down.
Yeah, and there's a number of different issues that kind of get blended together. I mean, one are the issues of therapeutic uses of genomics, and then the other are the selective issues around genomics. And as we said earlier, that you can, let's just say that a person is going through IVF, and let's just say that you extract 10 eggs from the women, and for the man, the sperm is much easier to extract. But let's say then you have 10 fertilized eggs, you'll be able to do a full genomic analysis on each of those 10 through PGD. And if your goal is to select out Huntingtons or to find boys, that's one thing. But I think, in my view, we'll very quickly get to a point where you'll be able to have probabilities based on the mathematics, the kind of work that Lee and others are doing, about what do we know about each of these potential futures. And there are some who say that through stem cells or induced stem cells, we'll be able to generate larger numbers of eggs, because right now human eggs are a limiting factor. And then if you have 1,000 eggs that are blastocysts, that are fertilized eggs, and you're doing this probabilistic analysis of each of them, it really opens up a lot of issues and a lot of possibilities, some of which are very frightening to many people. And so if and when, Bob Klitzman, we get to the point where embryo selection is the norm, and as I've said before, I think that we are very quickly getting to that place. How do you think? What are the dangers of how that may or may not change the way we think about our children?
Well, I think it has great potential to do great good, but there are caveats, and there are things we need to be careful about and cautious about. So, for instance, we are identifying genetic markers that are associated with autism, with schizophrenia, and potentially with intelligence, with IQ on the higher end, not just things that will lead to intellectual deficits. And so let's say we have I choose an embryo that, let's say, is going to have higher IQ genes. Or let's say in the future, we also have genes that are associated with different kinds of athletic ability. And I should say the other technology to enter here is we now can take blood from the arm of a pregnant woman and essentially sequence the whole genome of the fetus. So we can know very easily what the whole genome of the fetus is, and we know some people may say, well, that's a terrible disease that the fetus is going to have. I want to terminate the pregnancy. But of course, as we look toward the future, there will no doubt be people who may say, well, the fetus has an increased risk of autism, I'd like to terminate that fetus. And of course, the problem is that these are probabilistic numbers that we're dealing with. So for instance, the genes may say that the fetus has, say, 3 or 4 times the risk of autism. Well, that may mean that the risk of autism goes from 4% to 16% or 20%. So the odds are still 80% that the fetus won't have autism, but of course, people may decide 4 times the risk of autism, let's terminate the fetus. The problem is, let's say Johnny's born or Sally's born, goes to school, and let's say Johnny or Sally has or doesn't have genes associated with, let's say, increased intelligence or autism. Parents may say, well, Johnny, or the teacher may say, Johnny has those genes associated with autism. I'm going to spend a little less time with Johnny, or the parents may spend less time with Johnny, or conversely, if Sally has genes that are associated with increased intelligence, teachers may say, well, we're going to spend more time with Sally, or et cetera. The problem is that for a lot of traits, it was thought 10, 20 years ago that there would be single markers found for many traits. And you still see headlines sometimes, or going back the past few years, scientists discover the fat gene, or the gay gene, or the cancer gene, or the heart disease gene. And still, I think often in the public mind, and there is a belief that we'll be able to find very predictive genetics for many things. And we're finding for thousands of diseases fairly predictive genetics, but they tend to be for rare diseases. For no common disease, for most cases of most common diseases, we've not found very predictive markers still. Now, we may in the future with polygenic genes, we may find that if you have 15 of 20 genes, that increases your risk significantly. But I think there is a danger that how teachers look at this, how schools look at this, how parents look at this, Johnny may, let's say, have genes associated with athleticism. We're finding for certain kinds of athleticism, if you want to be a sprinter, there's certain genes, and these tests are marketed now, by the way. There are tests you can have your child tested to see if he or she is going to be a sprinter or not. Well, Johnny may not be interested in being a sprinter, even though he has the genes, and yet the school or parents may say, but you have the genes, you have to do it, or vice versa. So I think these are the kinds of misunderstandings, misinterpretations that may come about, but I think we live in a society in which there is racism, in which there's discrimination. I should say that life insurance companies now can completely discriminate on the basis of your genome. If there is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which covers health insurance. But if I apply for life insurance or disability insurance or long-term care insurance, my insurer today can say, well, I want to see your genome. And based on my genome, we're going to increase your rates or not give you insurance. And I think these are very real concerns I think we as a society need to address, because I think the technology, as we're hearing, has great potential, but what we do with it is up to all of us.
Well, I think, Bob, when you use the term we, I don't know who the we is. I do know that babies are, women get pregnant, women have babies. They're often having babies with their partners. And the most important thing to prospective parents is to have a healthy baby. That outweighs everything else. The baby's born, you want to have a healthy child. We have genetic technologies now that can decrease the risk of genetic disease. So it's not curing disease, it's avoiding disease. And when you're using these technologies, parents don't use them in isolation. They're using them with their physicians and the clinics, and physicians and clinics exist in a society. So I just don't see it going that way right now. I see the technology used to avoid genetic disease.
But I think it will be both. I mean, we are human beings, and it's hard to name one technology that has had promise to help us in some big way that has other dangers. I think of nuclear that we haven't charged forward on. And that doesn't mean that the good things aren't real and the dangers aren't real. And the challenge for us is how do we find that balance? And especially with this, where the same technologies are allowing us to prevent all of these terrible diseases. And I think everybody would like to be rid of those things, will over time give us these capabilities to as I was saying earlier, to rewrite or reselect our genetic code in a way that's going to fundamentally change us and over time change us as a species. And that raises questions, and maybe we'll ask you this, Susan, about the regulatory environment. There are many of us who are afraid, and I certainly, I've written about this, that if we open up the regulatory process too soon, the Luddites are going to march in, and then all these incredible technologies are going to be cut off. But there are also fears that there are many people, the transhumanists among them, who think this Homo sapiens 1.0 is a faulty model. If nature is so great, why am I losing my hair?
Okay, so...
But how do we think about finding that balance?
So first, I want to say that I not only agree with Lee, but also the best minds and the money is really focused on disease, understanding disease, and trying to use these techniques, whether it's from a public health perspective in developing countries, or whether it's trying to deal with Tay-Sachs or cystic fibrosis or many of the other diseases. That's really where the intellectual weight and the financial weight is going. I take comfort from that. Yeah. The other is, first, let me say, there's absolutely no danger that we have to worry about the FDA opening up things too quickly, all right? So let's just put that out there. That is definitely not happening anytime soon. And in fact, one of the things that we do is we work, when we're looking at trials, with other nations' regulatory systems that we in the US feel comfortable with. So we work with the UK, we work with the Karolinska in Sweden, or in Japan. But Japan, I'll mention this, has just completely redone its regulatory system. They're creating, they'll have it in April, in effect, a new NIH for stem cell research, for IPS technology, which they invented in 2007.
IPS is induced pluripotent stem cells.
Right, so it's an
Induced
alternative way of making stem cells, not from the leftover IVF material, but actually from about an apple seed worth of skin from a skin biopsy, or actually now we can do it from blood. So, and you use different tricks to turn the little bit of skin back into what would be like an embryonic stem cell, so it's an induced pluripotent stem cell. But in the Japanese system, what they're doing, which is very interesting, is they're going to have a 30-day review for safety. So any trial using this IPS, induced pluripotent stem cell technology, is reviewed, guaranteed a 30-day turnaround for safety. Now after that, there's going to be a second review. That's extraordinary. I can't imagine the FDA returning a phone call in 30 days. They are just really slow. So I think the fact that we have kind of a stuck regulatory system, and they're good people, but it's it's not even the Queen Mary. I don't know what analogy you want to use. It's very tough to get things done. I don't think that we're in danger of having willy-nilly issues there. I think there will be those people who decide they want to focus on sex traits, which they do now, and maybe get into when things are less predictive and more kind of reality. So you don't just have a genetic probability, but you actually have a biological reader. People may want to do the kind of selection that frankly makes me very uncomfortable, but we then have IRBs, we've got ethics boards and so forth. And as a society, I mean, we have steak knives. We assume that we're not going to be stabbing people with them. We have dangerous chemicals that we work with all the time. There is a certain point at which society, societal norms, the social contract come into play. And I think that's, we have wonderful protocols now before we approve trials and so forth.
Yeah, and yet, different societies will have different regulatory frameworks. I mean, you talked about collaborating with the UK and with others. And yet there are other countries out there, or even people who are not in countries, who have different views. George Church, how do you think we should think about the issue of cultural difference and people with different regulatory frameworks in different countries, when the thing that if people are changing the genome, it's a pretty profound thing, and if somebody changes the human genome in a heritable way someplace else, that's going to touch us. Will we have laws making it illegal for people to procreate with people who've been transformed? How do you see this playing out internationally?
Well, I'm not sure the cultures are that different when you come right down to it. The FDA is not fundamentally different from other food, other regulatory agencies, and the social norms are not that different. I mean, there might be subtle differences in which ones like their foods to be, GMO soybeans or not. But when it comes to severe health problems, if it's safe and effective, it gets approved. I think that the slippery slope, if there is one, will be if you have a therapy that, let's say, works on adults, but it also affects their germline, just because it's acting on every cell in your body. Do you have to have them bank their germline before they get the procedure? Is there really that fundamental a difference? Is it really more heritable if it's in the germline than otherwise? I mean, it strikes me as an abstraction that we've become obsessed with. My cell phone looks kind of like my daughter's cell phone, and it will look like her daughter's cell phone. That's heritable. Right? We get attached to our technology to such an extent you can't pull it away. Right? So if we wanted to make a germline modification and reverse it, we could do that, but we will become addicted to it the way we are to cars and foods and so on. So I'm not that sure that there's that fundamental cultural barrier, nor is there going to be a huge problem with people exchanging gametes with people who may or may not be genetically modified.
So
I'd also like to add to that I mean, this is actually a process that occurs naturally. There's many people from Northern Europe are lactose tolerant as adults. That's a mutation that occurred 8,000 years ago, probably in Turkey, and it's when cow domestication. So domesticated cows came along. There was a selective advantage to mutations that allowed you to digest lactose in milk. So, you know what, we changed. Most people in this audience probably can digest milk. Not everyone, but most people. And so that's, a form of evolution.
Right, and for sure, we as a species, as I said in my introduction, have been changing for 4 billion years.
Yes.
The question for us, though, is we're about to have a much more active, conscious process for doing so. So in your remarks earlier, Lee, you mentioned predictions that you made in your book. So I'm going to push you on this. Imagine that you are a woman going in for IVF 20 years from now. What does the process look like? What are the choices that you need to make?
I suspect that people will separate sex from reproduction, and that's because they'll find out in many cases, maybe 30%, 40% of couples may find that there's hidden risk of some kind, not just simple genes, but will reach a point where even complex diseases where there's risk. And they'll be able to avoid that risk by going through IVF and PGD. And so the question is, some people won't do it, that's fine, but a lot of people will do it. I mean, when the first so-called test tube baby was born, that was Louise Joy Brown in 1978, the whole world was horrified by this technology that was applied to reproduction. And now, in this day and age, the vast majority of people have no problem with IVF. I mean, people our age all know people who have used IVF to overcome fertility problems. And so, when we're talking about having a child and the potential risk of disease and being able to avoid your child inheriting that disease from you and a partner, a lot of people are going to say, this is good. This is good for my child. It's also good for society.
If I can just comment on that. I mean, one concern is cost. So IVF costs around $20,000 per cycle. We here, and many of us in the audience here on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, one of the most affluent areas in the world, all know people who've undergone IVF. But There are people who can't afford it or can afford one cycle of it, or who say, I've put my house under a second mortgage to be able to pay for it. And insurance companies are not generally covering it. If they cover it, they'll cover one cycle. And there are many issues. Actually, one large issue is who should they cover it for? So for instance, if a woman was fertile at 32, decided to have a career, and now at 42 or 44 she wants to have children and can undergo IVF, it may take her, the success rate may be, say, 10% per cycle. So she wants 10 cycles. So that's going to be $200,000. Insurance companies certainly don't want to pay that. We can say that we should mandate that they do, but we live in a country in which Obamacare has barely eked by, in which it's still under threat, in which there's still millions of people, despite Obamacare, who don't have any health insurance. And so I think there are larger issues. Hopefully we will cover all of this. But given that the pie may only be so big, there may be questions as to whether we should spend $20,000 a pop for IVF versus giving basic health services to certainly people in the developing world, often who don't have clean water or sanitation, let alone people in this country who still, I would argue, often lack basic health care. I think these are questions we need to think about.
Absolutely. I think that's fundamentally true. And yet, if Lee is right, that this is going to be the way that we reproduce in the future, or a certain set amongst us, then insurance and government expenditures will follow. And the cost, I mean, over the last month, the cost of IVF has been cut in half by new, at least in some processes, through new incubation processes. So it seems like it won't always be $20,000. As this stuff mainstreams, societal attitudes will change. But you're absolutely right that there will be a big question, haves and have-nots. And if it's risk avoidance, that's one thing. But so you talked about risk avoidance, and maybe Susan, I'll ask you this question. 20 years from now, if more and more people, which is absolutely the case, likely to be the case, are having children through IVF, will it be risk avoidance? Will that be the primary driver? And we're going to know so much more about how to read the genome 20 years from now. Will we, do you think, as a species, and maybe George, I'd love to get your thoughts, be able to say we're just going to focus on risk avoidance, or we're going to start thinking about selection among embryos?
I'm very humbled by the fact that every time we learn something, one of the things we learn generally is how much more complicated it is. A lot of discovery is like Russian nesting dolls. Mm-hmm. So I'm not so sure that we're there in 20 years. But, and I do think that we will make substantial progress, very substantial progress, in being able to either edit out or correct.
Not with the FDA, but with us.
I mean, a few thoughts on that. I mean, one is, of course, the United States spends 50% more per person on health care, and yet if you look at the top 27 countries, we're number 27th in our mortality, for instance, and we don't do well with our money. But in answer to your question, I think part of the issue is that for intelligence and for many traits, genetics, we know from twin studies, genetics explains about half.
Right.
And so the rest is other stuff. So some is your genes, some is your diet, your exercise, what you breathe in, your interpersonal relationships, how you're raised. So there are limits on how much we can fully predict, I think, if that's part of your question.
It is, but assuming, let's just say the embryo selection with 10 blastocysts, you have to assume whatever the range of potential IQ will be among your 10 potential children, and you're selecting the top, that would have a potential big impact. The Chinese at their company BGI have this cognitive genomics initiative, and they think they can bump up IQ through embryo selection by 20 points per generation. They may be totally wrong, but at least they think about that. They're putting resources behind it. Why don't we go to questions from the audience? So this one, well, this is kind of like connected to what Bob was saying, but I think everybody may have thoughts. If we could eliminate all genetic diseases through these kinds of technologies, would it be immoral not to do so? Maybe you want to just kind of go quick.
So I think there's, if it's I would hope that with these technologies, we are able to make them accessible to everyone. I think that's the goal, is that these technologies should not just be for the haves who get even more versus the have-nots. So I think, yes, I think we have a commitment to social betterment. I think that's one of the great virtues of science, is that not only is it intellectually interesting, but it can help people. And I think we should push that. So I think there is an ethical imperative, providing people know what they want. And the issue is also there are going to be some gray areas. But yes, I think we should try to do as much as we can for social good.
And however it's rolled out, if it is rolled out, not everybody will have access to it at the same time. Susan?
Well, people don't have access to the same level of healthcare now.
Right.
Yeah, I think it is immoral not to do all we can to eliminate disease.
I would agree that it's immoral not to do everything we can to eliminate disease, but I wouldn't interfere with a woman's reproductive rights.
George?
Well, I think it's a little more complicated than everybody has made it, in the sense that you don't want to have the government mandating that we do all of this, right? So it's not that simple. And also, what about the ultimate disease, which is aging?
Yeah.
Is that something where we have a moral imperative to prevent osteoporosis and higher rate of immunological failure? If someone is hurting from aging, is there a moral imperative to reverse that?
Right.
If that's the most powerful way to get them out of pain and suffering, what about that?
And as we said before, I mean, at least when I thought of this series, one of the topics that we're going to discuss in the future is the quote-unquote end of aging. And I know that's something that you've written about, and that's a good segue into the next question, which we'll start with the question and then build on it. So I'll start with you, George. The child born in 2014, this year, who lives the longest among all of the children born this year, will live to be how old?
Well, the record so far is 122 years.
Right.
So, but that doesn't happen every year.
Right.
So it's going to be on the order of.
But it won't be 150. It will be.
We don't know because some of these breakthroughs are nonlinear.
Yeah.
We have exponential improvement in costs and quality of sequencing and genome editing. I really would. I love talking about the future.
Yeah.
I think that number is very hard to pin down. Because if in 6 years we can bring down the cost of sequencing from $1 billion to 3,000, what can we do in 120 years?
Yep.
Right? That's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
You're asking me to predict 120 years out when 6 years brought on a revolution.
Yeah, and that I think is this essential point, is that the speed of innovation forward is not based on the speed of historical innovation. I mean, it's the famous J curve. And so that's when I was saying before that the science is advancing exponentially, but our imagination is moving forward linearly. It's hard for us even to imagine the speed. And when you think of, from the first announcement of the Human Genome Project not that long ago to all of these issues that we are talking about, and if you just keep multiplying exponentially this rate, I think it's a great point. Bob?
I was going to say, I think the answer depends partly on what commitment we as a society want to make to science. And the question is, the NIH budget has been essentially flat, if not gone down the past 10 years. And I think we have choices. In other words, I think we personally should spend more money on science because it can help push all of these fronts. At the same time, there are questions. There are some who say, well, we should not push aging. We should take care of diseases that are killing people at younger ages. We could do both if we invest the money, I think. And I think that's another set of political questions that will guide some of the answer to that.
But does it matter what we do as a country? I mean, we, the United States, will make a certain set of decisions like we did under George Bush, where we said, and Susan was the big hero of this story, where we said we're going to curtail stem cell research. And so it was easy enough. Our scientists just moved to Singapore. I think many of us have visited the Biopolis there. They built this incredible research facility, and everybody went there, and then things got better, and they came here. Does it even matter what we do as a country?
It's also the case that private money is being used. A lot of private money is going into science. I mean, the stem cell issue is a special issue because our government was making it difficult to put money into stem cells. But when we're talking about genetic research for aging, for example, the government doesn't put the money in. Private individuals will, other countries will. It's not going to stop the research from going on.
One of the topics that a lot of people have talked about is what role is there? We've talked about national level regulation, and for so much that touches our lives in a brass tacks way, it's national level legislation. And yet there have been efforts over the years to have some kind of international treaty, UN, and they've all gone nowhere for obvious reasons, because there's the difficulty of bringing together the countries that are more gung-ho about this stuff, and countries, quote-unquote, countries like the Vatican and others who are dead set against it. Really anybody, but what are the possibilities that this could be or should be an issue for international consideration?
I think it increasingly is international. I'd be curious George's point of view, but look at the discovery of Higgs boson, right? The particle was really a multi-international effort where countries pooled together however many billions of dollars to do it, and I think that's an option. I should say the U.S. is still, the NIH still is, in terms of government funding, is really the big player in terms of the amount of money that we as a country invest in biomedical research is much higher than other countries, partly because we're the largest economy. And it's not clear what pharmaceutical companies, for instance, there's a tradition of often NIH is what does early work that then gets picked up by other companies with additional investments, many of which who are wary to get involved too early. But I think future, more international collaboration would be terrific.
Well, there's international collaboration now for a haplobank.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a view using this IPS technology that it will be possible to make stem cells for anyone who needs a stem cell transplant. So everyone will be able to have a transplant because they'll be able to have a match. And in countries that are very homogeneous, for example, Japan, they believe they can do it with 150 lines from 150 people. But in our country, it would take many more, about 25,000. So we've started meeting with representatives from, in some cases, it's governments. In some cases, in our case, we're doing it, not a government. And we have participation from all of the countries that have significant stem cell research and genetic programs. So there is coming together of people.
And there's also foundations which can the Gates Foundation puts a huge amount of money into biomedical research.
George, do you have any further thoughts before we move to the next question?
Let's move on.
Okay, so we talked earlier about personalized medicine, that over time, essentially everybody's genome will be part of their electronic medical file. And so now when people are doing this genetic analysis, the numbers are relatively small. But when there are millions, hundreds of millions, billions of people, and all of their genomes are on file, and because of Moore's law, computing power will be vastly expanded, we're going to be able to understand through just data analysis a lot more than we understand now. So the question for us is, will that, and then maybe we'll end with this kind of philosophical question. The more that take it a step back, in prehistoric times, God or whatever, the divine power, were all of those things that were outside of our understanding. So it was weather, it was the river spirits, and as we've learned more and more, our sense of what exists in the spiritual realm has been more and more isolated. As we learn more about the genome, what will be left of the unknowable, the soul, the divine, all of these kinds of things that are such an important part of who we are? Is that a space that will always be just the space just beyond our grasp, or are we entering into some kind of scientific age where we internalize, even if we don't have all the answers, that we as beings are knowable? So why don't we go there and just make thoughts on that and any kind of final comments you may have.
For the level I think you're getting at, genes won't tell us enough. There's no gene that is a Mozart gene or a Shakespeare gene, right? I mean, there are genes give us a certain amount, but what makes, many people may have had the same, let's just say, set of genes that they could have had the intellectual capacity of a Shakespeare or Mozart or Michelangelo, whomever. Not all did that. And so whatever, I'll say divine inspiration, but whatever inspiration, whatever allowed a Mozart to become a Mozart and write things that we'll call sublime for a moment, whatever that is, I think is beyond the level of what the bricks are. So genes in a way may in the end be sort of like what makes this auditorium is we see wood, 3 different kinds of wood, there are nails, there are lights, there's glass, but in the end what makes it look the way it is not just the ingredients alone, but someone fashioned them and there was human touch. And I think those are things that genes are essential, but they won't be everything at the level you're talking about. I mean, think of clouds. Clouds all are made of the same stuff but look different. And I think there's a certain element that'll still be up to something beyond what we can predict.
Susan?
Well, I certainly hope so, and I believe so. I think the part of life that's experience, human interaction, experience with our environment, that's not something that you can quantify in A, C, T's, and G's.
Lee?
Well, some people mistakenly think that the genome is a blueprint for human life, and that's certainly not the case. It's much better to think of it as a recipe, and a recipe gives you a rough idea, but certainly it's not equivalent to the human being that emerges from a particular genome. And I think we just want to make sure that the recipe that emerges doesn't have diseases that would harm people that we can avoid.
George?
Yeah, well, I think this is more complicated than brushing it aside and saying that we can't predict it because it has an environmental component. Many things that have environmental components we can predict quite well. So you have a malnourished child, you can predict with great, confidence the consequences of that. So genes plus environment may become quite predictable. Furthermore, if we're thinking about spirituality and caring for one another and all the rest, we are going to have we have had radical change in our environment already. We are not at all like the primitive societies. And as we go into space, as we will almost certainly do, if nothing else, to avoid asteroids hitting the planet and wiping us all out, that's a whole new set of environments, a whole new set of genetic modifications we might have to do to avoid osteoporosis due to weightlessness and so on. So the challenge is going to be ensuring that the environment that brought us the spirituality and caring for one another and so forth isn't destroyed as we become more mechanized, for example, as we add instruments to our lives and radically change our environment. So we may have to change because of the environment is no longer what it used to be.
Yeah. So I think you all agree, based on the silence in the room, that these issues are just so profound for us as a species, for addressing disease and for healthcare, but so much more than that, for defining our trajectory into the future. And once we pass, as we've already passed, into this genetic future, there won't be turning back. And so the critical piece of this is having these kinds of conversations to try to figure out how do we want to shape this thing, because the technology is there, the science is moving forward, but what's not happening, or we're not having the depth of conversation and dialogue, not only among experts, but among everybody, to try to figure out what are our standards, what are things, what is too far, what resources do we want to put into this, and where do we think it's all going. So, which that brings me back to what I was saying in the beginning about the 92nd Street why, and that there are a few in this world, and certainly in this city, just places where we can have these kinds of meaningful conversations. And the 92nd Street why, thanks to Henry and Lawrence and the team here, is really one of those places. And so we're thrilled that you're all here, but to participate in this conversation, it's not just being here and listening to this. What we would love for everybody to do is think about who are the people in your life who you can engage so that we can bump up this level of dialogue about this absolutely essential issue. And so with that, I thank you. A number of us will be in the back, but thank you for being here.